Good afternoon. I have the distinct privilege and pleasure this afternoon to bring you the dessert course in the interview buffet. We've had a lot of, but actually before I go into that, I want to sort of follow pattern and talk a little bit about one of the most influential teachers in my life, and I'm going to ask you to do the same if that's okay. Mrs. Ball was, when I went from the ground floor to the second floor in fourth grade, was the most imperious being I'd ever seen. And she was imperious and she was stern, but she was also loving and kind and engaging in many ways for fourth grade minds to know that they could reach. She inspired my love of literature, my faith in my ability to write, and most importantly, even at that young age, instilled in me the notion of personal responsibility to be the change that you want to see in the world as you go out and embrace it. So that's, for me, Mrs. Ball was amongst those amazing teachers who inspired me. I'd love to hear about yours.
You bet. Mine would probably be Mr. Schindel, who was my high school English teacher, and probably not for what we did in class, but for the fact that he started me on our own kind of one-person book club, which he would every month or so find a new novel he would bring me to read, and then we would spend late hours in the evening sitting in his office debating those books. I just think probably no one had a more profound impact on helping me learn to love literature than Mr. Schindel. Yeah. I can't imagine my life now without The Count of Monte Cristo or A Man for All Seasons or True Grit in the same way I probably couldn't imagine my life now without Mr. Schindel.
Marvelous. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mike Johnston, a state senator from Colorado. He's another one of those inspiring individuals, and we're going to talk a little bit about the inflection points of the policy piece of the work that we've done. You saw a lot about the continuum of education and the spectrum of it is. You've heard some words from Bill, especially about amazing things that have happened in Colorado, from Melinda about sort of policy changes. Some of the previous speakers that we've had up here today sort of talking about those inflection points and the grit that's required in the policy space, in legislatures, in state houses, in departments of education that are required. And we want to explore that a little bit with you and draw upon Senator Johnston's sort of deep veins of experience in that work in tilling the soil in Colorado. I want to start with probably the seminal bill, SB 191, which was the establishment of teacher support and teacher evaluation in Colorado. Can you talk to us a little bit about sort of the inflection points that were really important in that process of getting SB 191 passed?
You bet. And thanks so much for having me as the last speaker before lunch, which is always the best spot. But I will cold call you, Mike Petrilli, if you're not paying attention. I like the way Jonathan Klein is actively listening in the back of the room. Thank you.
Nice.
I think that one of the critical components for us around the success of that legislation, one of the things we learned was the ability to build and sustain an incredibly broad coalition. I remember the first day I actually introduced the idea of the legislation was at a parent meeting of Latino families and kids in Northwest Denver, and most of the presentation we did in Spanish. And nice. So the mainstream media got a hold of it and was sort of frantically trying to translate it back in English to release it. But that was symbolic. It's kind of the first place we started the conversation to say, here's why we think this legislation matters. And we looked at, by the time it was over, we had not just the Urban League and the NAACP and business leaders and teachers organizations and principals and superintendents, but I think the two kind of most powerful moments in the passage were, one, at this very long hearing and divisive hearing, we had a panel of 3 teachers, many of them career-long teachers, who got up and said, here is why we think this is right for our profession, and here's why we're going to stand behind this. I remember we were at the last vote we had to get on the House floor. We were 1 vote short, and we had kind of sent everybody we had at these swing votes. We had sent U.S. senators and governors and college roommates and old boyfriends. We'd tracked every part of these people's history and found whoever we could to leverage them, and we couldn't get the last vote until we brought this legislator into a high school classroom at East High School down the road from Manual with a group of juniors and their teacher, and she sat and listened to a group of kids for 30 minutes talk about why this mattered, and she walked out of that room and called me that day and said, I'm a yes. I think those were the powerful moments that made it possible.
Nice. That's great. It's marvelous. And it took the sort of the monumental lifts in many legislatures that it takes is pretty amazing. I want to sort of riff off of 191 a little bit to talk about the day after.
Yeah.
Because the sort of getting it to that finish line is just the one thing. The next piece of it is what do you do the day after? How do you sort of engage in the communities that you need to make sure that it's successful in implementation?
As a former high school principal, it feels a lot like the day after high school graduation, where you think you've done everything right, and then all of a sudden you realize you have the whole task of getting them through college. And so we found that. I think that a lot of times legislation is sort of like the diffusion of light for the science teachers in the classroom. Think about how light passes through a keyhole, and as soon as it gets through that keyhole, it then refracts all the way throughout the room. So that small coalition is together for one moment, and once it passes that object, it then completely fractures. And what we found is that the most important work of the legislation is actually after the legislation is over. All of the success or failure is not in the votes you count on the floor, it's in actually what you do around regulations, around implementations, around legal challenges. And so for us, the thing that our state did the best was we built this coalition that actually persevered over time. Organizations like the Colorado Children's Campaign or Colorado Succeeds or Democrats for Education Reform, who were not just there when the votes were counted, they were there at every single meeting of the State Council on Educator Effectiveness. They were there to build a coalition to defend the legal challenges. They were there every year to make sure that we prevented any repeal efforts that might come. And the amazing thing is, if you look now, 4 or 5 years after its passage, we did last year a poll of public opinion on where people stand, and it is now more popular than it was when it passed. Almost 80% of Coloradans now support this bucket of reforms. That's even more than support pot in our state, which is incredible. Probably only the Broncos pull that high in Colorado. So I think that coalition, and it really was, so we built a laser, which was that coalition stayed tight and focused so that the light remains focused over time. It's easier to change the direction of a laser if you have the whole team together, but if you can't keep the team together, very hard to reassemble them.
I love your description of the laser. I think it's very apt. Talk about a little bit of the struggle about how it is to keep the coalition together. There are lots of ways that different constituencies can sort of pick at. I'd love to hear a couple of instances where people were trying to sort of pick off your coalition members and they could get themselves organized and stay together. It's a tough enterprise.
I mean, literally it was much like your conversation about sitting down and talking to teachers. It was making a commitment that we were a family that was going to continue to sit down at the table every week together. And there are always going to be battles. There are always going to be, I heard that he said that she said that you didn't carry as much of your weight. But what you find is those disagreements fester the longer you spend apart from each other. The ability to say, you know what, let's come back every week and sit down and say, what's your biggest priority next? It's okay if that might not be my biggest priority, but we still have these same number of things that we're committed to. Yeah. And so I think it really has been, like any relationship, it's about the work, right? And oftentimes it's more about putting in the work than about where you stand on any one. It's not often about picking up the milk. It's sometimes just about making sure that you're listening to the fact that you forgot to pick up the milk.
Right. I think, we all know those stories. The notion of allies.
Not that I've ever done that.
No, none of us have ever done that. Or pick up the kid.
Yes, that's right. That's worse, it turns out.
Apparently. The sort of the notion of allies, and in some instances unlikely allies, is one that runs through sort of the necessity to build coalitions and keep them together. I'd love to hear from you sort of some of the unlikely allies you might have come across as you're building these coalitions, as you're sort of moving this work forward and keeping it entrenched in Colorado.
You know, I think that probably comes out of one of our biggest mistakes, which I think we learned from. You know, it's very hard for me flying to Seattle because I get PTSD around the Broncos-Seahawks Super Bowl. And so, which was actually a profound lesson for me, because I think it underscored for me the risk of, and what are the risks of winning big, which is for about 2 years after that Super Bowl, I would be walking through an airport and see a perfectly nice, like 50-year-old woman walking down the ramp wearing a Seahawks jersey. And I just couldn't resist the temptation to like reach out and trip her, right? Or like sort of elbow her in the jaw as she walks by.
As a Niner fan, I feel the same way, yes.
Which was instructive, because why is that? Well, because we were all there with our entire hearts in this game, and there on national television, we all sort of got humiliated, right? Or embarrassed. And the risk of winning big is that someone loses big. And the risk of losing big is that someone resents deeply that loss. And so I think what we did immediately after, I think by winning alone, we planted the seeds of our own counter-reformation, right? Which is, if we should have at that moment right away built a campaign to go out and engage teachers and parents and school leaders to talk to them. What do you do on your own team when you have an issue that's highly contentious with a massive disagreement? You all agreed to go forward on the same page, but you as a leader make sure and attend to the folks in that coalition who are on the losing side, right? And I don't think we did that right away, which is I think why we lost ground on that. I will say we've recovered from that. I think one of the best things we've done in the past 5 years in Colorado, led by the Gates' work, is this work on implementation and support of evaluations through the Colorado Education Institute, we have this group that actually helps support teachers and principals in the field and learning about how to use the evaluation, how to support it, so that it is, as Bill said, an actual tool for improvement.
Right.
You know? And so I think more attention to and engagement of the field has been a big help.
Good.
I'm still waiting for the call from Richard Sherman to tell me that we're all in this together. But when that comes, I'll be more supportive.
I just have to say it's a delight for me to be your straight man. I just got to tell you. So branches of government, we all struggle. So very often, especially in the policy space, we have an executive, a governor or a state chief saying that the legislature's to blame, and the legislature saying you guys are idiots, and all those sorts of activities. I'd love to hear sort of your perspective, sort of guidance for those of us sort of working in a number of other states about how sort of the coalition of legislative and executive, the interactions between the two branches, made a difference and has been making a difference in the work.
I mean, I'd be clear, we have a long way to go in Colorado. I think we are proud of the significant number of things we've done, not just this, but we did a massive overhaul on early literacy with the READ Act. We passed our version of the DREAM Act called Asset. We've done school finance overhaul with financial transparency, done a real focus on early childhood expansion. And we've done that, most significantly, to your point, over 6 years through 4 different Senate presidents, 4 different speakers of the House, 4 different chairs of the state board, 3 different state commissioners, 2 different governors, partridge in a pear tree, sort of all of those. And the way that works, I think, is because of the strength of the civic coalition that operates outside of the Capitol, right? I think, as Marquita said, sort of nuts like us come and go, right? But actually one thing that is constant in really healthy ecosystems are a coalition of civil rights groups, teachers, principals, business leaders who say, hey, we know you're new on the job, Mr. Governor or Mr. State Senator. Let us tell you how we do things here. Let us tell you what our values are that are deeply Colorado that you're going to want to be a part of, because this is just what we all share.
Yeah, that's very good advice. That's very good advice to us. Part of the continuum, as we've been talking about, is pre-K as well as post-secondary. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, I'm sure we all would, about sort of the interactions that are happening in Colorado between the K-12 system and the post-secondary system, and some of the things that we need to get after in that space.
I mean, obviously you heard some compelling talk this morning about that. I think we've had the same struggles. We know a big part, and this is why the Common Core has been so meaningful for us, is about preparation. Right? Well, you think about Colorado as a pretty wealthy and successful state. What we know when you look at ACT as a metric for college readiness, only 25% of all the graduating seniors in Colorado are college ready on all the ACT metrics. You know, and that's a lot of white folks in middle-class neighborhoods that aren't college ready. And so I think we've tried to focus deeply on what does it mean to really be prepared and not be sending mom back a bill for remedial courses when you start at CU Boulder. But also then about perseverance and about completion. And so we're doing a couple things to move our funding structures towards outcomes for higher ed so that we can actually, and we have a new measure on the Denver ballot to do public financing for scholarship funds that are all linked to scholarships only at the end of successful completion of an academic year, so that those funds only go to universities and to partners that are helping kids not get to college but actually through it. So we're working on both a public financing structure that will focus on outcomes as well as some private partners who will say, how do we not get them to, but get them through?
Marvelous. And is the same coalition that was built around K-12 employing and bringing in new members to work through this set of the work?
We've really started to now expand that, both into the early childhood space and into the higher education space. We've passed some legislation on pay-for-success financing for early childhood education as a way to try to build those same groups who say kindergarten readiness matters so much. How do we make sure we're helping kids come in better prepared? We weren't able to pass a ballot measure to do it, and so we've tried to look at innovative ways to finance that, and that's really expanded a public-private partnership to do early childhood.
Marvelous, marvelous. We have a few minutes left, and I actually want to make it a little personal, and I'm throwing you a little bit of a curveball, but I've heard you speak very, very compellingly about why you do the work that you do. I've heard you speak about the constituents that you have and representing those constituents in really amazing ways. And I think the group would love to hear some of your stories about a little bit about why you do what you do and the people that you represent, because fundamentally, for any public servant, that's the reason you do it.
Yeah. I was moved by Carlos's comments earlier this morning, and I was just thinking about probably the most powerful moment for me in my legislative term was I came to office in part to work on this bill, our state version of the DREAM Act, which we called Asset, because I was the principal of the high school that had about 50% of our kids were Latino, and a significant number of those kids were undocumented. And we made this promise to get them all admitted to college and face the reality of so many of those kids who were admitted could never go because they were paying out-of-state tuition. And so We spent 3 years in the legislature trying to pass this, and it had been proposed for 11 years. So 11 years of work we had done and failed every time, and we tried to, same thing, how do you build a coalition broad enough to do this? And one of the things that was missing from that coalition was obviously a tremendous number of kids, but also the allies we needed, like Republican business leaders, like agriculture industry, like rural Little League coaches, who it turns out, when you got 7 kids on your team and you work with them all year long and you find out 2 of them are undocumented, that all of a sudden doesn't feel that fair to you in a way that an ideological question felt really different. So the most powerful experience for me is I remember we had this hearing and it went for probably 11 hours. It's almost 11 o'clock at night, and 11 o'clock at night there are probably still 100 people in the crowd, and probably 75 of them are students, are dreamers. And it's 11 o'clock at night, they're all still sitting there, and what are they doing? They're not sleeping, they're not texting, they're not listening to their iPhones. They are sitting there with books open, getting homework done.
Nice.
Because this issue is too important for them to leave, and yet so is making sure they're prepared for school the next day. Right? At that moment, sort of we knew the vote was over. But the most powerful moment of all for me was, I remember I was on the Senate floor when the final House vote got called on this, waiting 12 years for it to pass. And so I literally ran off the Senate floor, ran over to this group of students who were all waiting outside the hall, and as I got there, the last vote got cast, and this group just erupted into a kind of mosh pit of tears and laughter and singing. And I remember hugging this young woman who was 23 and said, I testified on this bill the first time when I was 12.
Wow.
And in that moment, you felt kind of the euphoria of a family finding their voice and using it to change the world. And I feel like that is still what's possible in politics if you engage the right partners, you build the right policy, and you maintain this relentless persistence.
Yeah, that's marvelous. So no lightning round for us, but as we are the dessert, love you to serve up parting shots.
Parting shots. No, I think that my parting shots are there is a when the road gets hard for me, there is a vignette that I go back to with my own staff, because I took my 2 boys recently to visit the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, if you have not been there. And in there they have the entire history of the bus boycott. And it's a kind of 303-day walk from day 1 to the end. And there's this great story on night 1, as you know, as the boycott was planned to be a 1-day boycott. And at the end of that one day, they come back together and say, wow, what do we do now? That was amazing, but I gotta get back to work tomorrow. And there is this back and forth. There's this woman in the back of the church, a woman named Mary Jo Smiley, who stands up and says, hey, I just want you to know, I have a car. So I say, well, that's very cute, but we're trying to solve a problem here. We don't care if you have a car. She says, no, I have a car, and I could get 10 people to and from work every day. All of a sudden, the room kind of stops. I say, wait a sec, well, who else has cars, and could we pull this off? And before they leave, you walk out with a plan where everyone has a commitment to get 10 people to and from. And for 1 day and 50 days and 150 days and 200 days, Mary Jo Smiley gets up every single day, gets 10 people to work, and gets them home. They get her fired from her job, and eventually around day 150, they come and they arrest her for, I don't know, conspiracy to commit equality. And they throw her in jail. And the leaders of the movement find out that Mary Jo Smiley's in jail. They're the little cute woman who had the idea about the car. They run to the jail. They bail her out. They say, we're so sorry. Please, please, you don't have to do any more of this crazy stuff again. And she says, stop. Give me my keys, because I got 10 people who got to get to work. And she does that on day 200 and 250 and 300 and 350. And on day 383, the system finally says, we give up. We give up not because Dr. King gave a great speech 383 days ago. We could beat that. What we couldn't beat was Mary Jo Smiley showing up every single day, relentlessly, to make sure the work gets done. And I feel like that is the moment we're in now, which is, what are we going to do as a coalition to commit to carrying those keys every single day and making sure we carry our part of the work relentlessly to make sure every kid gets there safely.
I think that's absolutely marvelous. I think that's exactly right. What we've been hearing today is we all have to have the grit. We all have to persevere in the work that we have to move forward and not waver from the work itself. Thank you very much, Mike Johnston, for being here. Thanks, Senator Johnston. Wonderful having you.